It's the final patch of the year, and it was a huge one. Not only did they introduce 6 costs in 1424, but they also had a big B patch in prepare for the holidays. Let's go ahead and waste no more time. Let's dive into the TFT Academy tier list so that you can gain infinite LP during your holiday break. The best comp in the game, without a doubt, are Chem-Barons. This is a loot streak mechanic where the more you're loot streaking, you're getting stacks of shimmer. The more shimmer you get, the more powerful items that you get for every stack of 100 that you're able to cash out. They buff Chem-Baron to give a lot more HP, and so it's way more consistent to play, even for just the 300, 400 cash outs. But 500 is ultimately what you aim for, and you do win the game if you get Chem-Baron, Crest, or a Crown, or even a Wandering Trainer. All these are very good reasons to go for it. I've seen people start Chem-Baron cash out loot streak as late as stage 3-1, play for like a 300, 400, and still win the game. And of course, if you're able to high roll and get 7 Chem-Baron early, you get 100 stacks per shimmer, and you can get to that 500 and win the game. I did a full Chem-Baron cash out guide video on my YouTube. Here's a small snippet of like how you combo certain items and basically what you should do with the perfected items. So make sure to check that out if you haven't already. As expected, if you just get HP augments for Chem-Baron, it's usually also an auto win. Like +1 Chem-Baron into Tiny Titans is just ridiculous, and you have so much HP to work with, and you're good to go. And then one tip I want to give in addition is that once you cash out, you oftentimes want to continue to play as many Chem-Barons as you can and skip the additional cash outs because you get extra HP, which makes Savika 2 and Silco 2 and Rennie 3, like all these units very, very powerful. And if you do end up cashing out 300, 400, a lot of times you end up playing like Silco 2 and Rennie 3, or maybe you play like a Smeech 3, Renata 3 as well. Just play around like whatever you can based off the combination of items and whatever you're able to actually aim for. Sometimes it's worth taking things like Unlikely Duo just so you can get the Savika, and you could probably fit Jinx in. And then, as most people probably understand by now, the way you cap most boards is to play Victor. And yes, if you're in Chem-Baron, you definitely want to play Victor. He is the most OP unit in the game. You might notice that we have like 2 items assigned to all these different champions, and that's intentional because you want to keep an item free for the Chem-Baron item. I've seen a lot of people prioritize Silco items. They go like, Shojin, Nashor's JG. They get 1 or even 2 items for Silco, and they're like, oh my god, what do I do with this? Like super awkward. They have like the random JG on Renata instead, and then it's just like a giant hodgepodge of awkward items. You use all your removers. Just try not to get stuck in that situation. But if you master this line and get Chem-Baron as your opener, you should be very, very likely to win the game. And even if you cash out something smaller, you can aim for that top 4 hyper consistently. Another comp that gets a lot of hype, particularly in China and other parts of APAC, is 7 Rebels. 7 Rebels is a very flexible core. Even though it's 7 units that want to be Rebel, you have 1 or 2 slots, which you can justify playing a bunch of different things. And if you can get to 9, you have even more options there. For Rebels specifically, you always want to be playing around Zoe if you can, and you want to give her really strong burst items. So Shojin, Jewel Gauntlet, and Guard Breaker is a really classic combo. A lot of people are actually trying out Rageblade as well on Zoe, and the data looks really good. So you can go Rageblade, Jewel Gauntlet, and Guard Breaker as well. Basically, Shojin and Rageblade are both interchangeable for Zoe, except that Rageblade is much more flexible, and Rageblade kind of commits you to Zoe, or I guess like Twitch or something else. So just be mindful of what you're slamming and when. Then you want to pick a duo carry of some kind. A lot of times people Zoe plus another AP unit because building AP is really easy with Zoe. So maybe you go like LeBlanc. You can play Nami in the meantime until you get to LeBlanc. Or you can play Heimerdinger. Heimerdinger ties in with Ezreal, who's a Rebel, and Academy. And guess what? You have a Sentinel with the Alawi and Irelia with Leona. So you actually have a lot of different options of how you mix and match. And then you can always throw in Mbessa. Mbessa's a quick striker and also kind of splashes in the Emissary. If you hit Jinx, you can play Echo. And then you can always splash in the 6 cost. And that's not even talking about other variations that you can play. You can play like Ezreal and Corki and lean AD Rebels and also try to develop that part of the composition. So Rebels has a lot of really big synergy. The number one thing to keep in mind, though, is that you do want an emblem. You don't need it. I've seen people play 7 Rebels successfully for a top 4 without the Rebel +1. But if you do get the Rebel emblem, it just allows you to cap super high. And of course, if you open up Rebel with a Wandering Trainer of some kind, it's very easy to get to 10 Rebel. All you need to do is find 1 more Rebel emblem, and you can play it as soon as level 9 and get 10 Rebel, which most of the time wins the game. 10 Rebel, for example, should be able to even beat the 500 cash out on Chem-Baron, but kind of depends on what that cash out is, because some combos with Chem-Baron are literally unbeatable. Nocturne Reroll is probably the highest cap reroll comp in the game. The ceiling of this composition is enormous, but it's largely gated through whether or not you have the artifacts for him. The best artifacts to play for Nocturne are Fishbones, Rapid Fire Cannon, and Sniper's Focus. And that's because it gives range extension for his overdrive blades to hit whatever target that he's aiming at in AoE. So intuitively, you look at Nocturne and he spins, and whoever's around and adjacent to Nocturne takes the damage. But if you extend his range, whoever's he attacking, that's the point at which he does AoE. And so if he has like +3 range, and let's say he's attacking someone around this Blitzcrank, the AoE will be around Blitzcrank instead, which is just wild when you start to combo his extension of his range and just does a ton of DPS. Combine that with, Automata giving a bunch of extra damage based off of 20 instances of damage, and then Quick Striker, which gives you attack speed, it starts to get nutty pretty quickly. So best in slot Nocturne is actually just 3 extensions. So, Rapid Fire, Fishbones, and Sniper's Focus. But you can also just play like, Fishbones or RFC or Sniper's Focus, and then just go like damage, like Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer is totally fine. I've seen people played Rage Blade. I've seen some people still play Quicksilver because they just wanted to be safe against like all the Elises, so on and so forth. The other question people have is, do I reroll like a Kali 3 with it, even though it kind of slots in very nicely at 2 costs, gives you easy access to roll for this at 6. But I'm pretty sure Kali 3 is a fraud, and you'd rather go for Twisted Fate 3, who is quite solid. He's not actually like the primary carry, but when you have Twisted Fate just as support DPS, he ends up doing a lot. So I wouldn't go out of your way to build like Twisted Fate items, but if you get left over a bunch of tiers and rods that you don't really want, just slap him on TF and just watch him go to town. And I actually like him more than Mbessa because Mbessa is 1, very contested, it's hard to hit, and 2, likely all the swords and gloves and stuff like that you want on Mbessa end up going on Nocturne, and you still want to have tank items for ideally Blitz 3. 6 Automata is always worth chasing. If you do get Automata, just put an Automata emblem on unit like Dr. Mundo, or inevitably try to put it on Mel, which is really insane. If you don't end up going for Nocturne with long artifact and you want to just play melee, go for something like, BT, Infinity Edge, and Quicksilver, and play around that as your core instead. So unsurprisingly, Living Forge, Artifactory, and Portable Forge will be the best augments. Also, Exalted Adventure has a chance of giving you Nocturne and Akali. Definitely go for that because Exalted Adventure also can give you artifacts. Speaking of Automata, 6 Automata is just insane. And the kicker is you actually don't even need any of these 3 stars. It looks like it's supposed to be a Kog'Maw reroll comp, but in reality, it's actually just a 6 Automata comp. I've seen Kog'Maw 2, Blitzcrank 2, and then literally 1-star everything else. Fast 9 pretty much for free with 60 HP. As long as you have good Kog'Maw items and you also have the Automata emblem ready to go. The best holder of Automata emblem by far is Mel. It's because I believe her conduit counts every instance of her AoE damage as separate damage instances to proc Automata, which is just crazy. If you're thinking about 1200, I guess it's nerfed, so a little bit less than 1200 damage every single time she's casting. I think she does it twice. It's actually obscene. So it's the best combo in the game with Automata. Absolutely try to prioritize some mana with her. And you can throw on Morello as well because she's a good applier of it. Kog'Maw's itemization actually changes a little bit because a lot of the damage is dealt through instances of damage, and Shiv on Kog'Maw is quite good. I've seen people go like pure attack speed. For example, I played a game where I had Rageblade Red Buff Shiv as my items, and I just had triple attack speed. And every time he's attacking, he's racking up those Automata instances of damage, and he also let me fast 9. Pretty gross. Downsides of the composition, well, if you don't hit Malzahar, you're never going to get 6 Automata, and 4 is noticeably weaker, especially towards the late game. Garen's really contested, so if you don't hit Garen and you don't have the Watchers, it can be tricky. And also, hitting Mel is like, really hard because they nerfed the odds for the beat patch. So you might have to just like make do with Victor or just put Automata on like Mundo or something else and be okay with that. But you do have some options. Don't feel like you have to roll for exactly this Watcher board. You can sub out 2 Watchers, play other different units that make sense, and just generally have good frontline for Kog'Maw. Is the most important thing here. Oh, but I will say that Gambler's Blade is still the nuts on Kog'Maw. If you get Gambler's Blade on him, it's insane. Lichbane and Wizhen are also 2 extremely good artifacts on him. That hasn't changed. Finally, in the S tier, we got Visionary Reroll. This is Renata and Singed as the primary stars. You want to go for Singed as your main anomaly priority, actually. And that's something that people don't really know. That's largely because, 1, it's a frontline stall comp, so you actually don't care that much about giving anomaly to Renata. And 2, the way Singe scales is very powerful because it gives your main carry more attack speed, aka your Renata, which will give another shield over to Singed. So it kind of has a really nice feedback loop where the more Renata casts and shields Singed, Singed is going to cast again, buffing Renata's attack speed. That gives her a bunch of attack speed to proc Shogun and Nashers to help her cast. And it's just kind of gross when you start seeing the loop go. The positioning here you might notice is center focused, and that's very deliberate because Renata actually shoots allies and gives them shield. You can actually justify putting Morgana like up one or Vex up one to fully concentrate that shield, and that's like a way for you to guarantee consistency of it. This is because if you corner Renata and you put all the units on the left side here, Renata might, for example, aim at the top left, but if you have like a unit here, Singed is going to be on the top right, so you kind of have a little bit of a mismatch of shielding. And that also means that you can get wrapped on the right side. Like a melee carry, let's say a Nocturne, doesn't have range, walks all the way, yada, 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 boom, just gets to your back line, and you're a big trub. So a lot of people prefer the center positioning. It's a little bit easier. It's more consistent. If you do get extra items, you can put on Vex 3 or Morgana 3, but you can replace Morgana for, you know, a Malzahar or Heimerdinger later on and go for 4 Visionary, 4 Sentinel. You also have options of going for +1 Sentinel and going for +1 Visionary if you want. Personally, I like the 4/4 because it's just cleaner, but you do have that option. Some really obscenely good augments in general for this Visionary reroll. Starry Night, because you have so many 1 to 2 cost you want to hit. Investment Strategy is actually really, really good because it helps stack. It's kind of like Ghost of Friends Past, but better. So think about that. And Power Shields. My God, every time you shield with Renata and all your Sentinels, you just get 10 durability and you get an additional shield that synergizes with the Sentinel resistances. It's just gross. So yeah, definitely keep an eye out for this comp. I will say that I think that this is a more consistent reroll comp. They technically nerfed it because they nerfed Singed, but I think it's a higher baseline, but it doesn't win as often. This composition, Nocturne, wins more often with the artifacts, but it's less consistent because you kind of need to hit that Nocturne. Otherwise, you're going to be struggling a lot. At the top of A tier, and you could argue at the bottom of S tier, is Family Reroll featuring Violet as your main carry, and then you play a bunch of Pit Fighters and ideally other family units. This is a composition that caps theoretically very, very high if you get the right combinations, but if you don't have the Exodia like Violet 4, which is much harder to force now because of the anomaly changes, or if you don't have like artifacts such as Suspicious Trenchcoat on your Violet 4, it's going to be noticeably worse, and you're mainly playing for top 4. Violet items, believe it or not, actually don't matter that much as long as you have like 3 items that kind of make sense. I personally like having Quicksilver on her in the current meta. There's so much stun. Also, like Victor comes online late game, gives Violet a really hard time. And then, you know, BT Titan's is a classic combo, but I've seen so many people play like Sterix and Hodge, Infinity Edge, Edge of Night. There's like a lot of different things you can do. What's kind of important is that you get items onto Violet quickly, like 3 items ASAP, and you get items onto the Draven, so that way you can duo carry. Violet can't do it 100% on her own. And so that's why item augments end up being really, really good. So Prismatic Pipeline, Dark Alley Dealings, which just gives you the trench coat, and other things like that, like Unleash the Beast or something like that, can be pretty powerful to just help you get your snowball going. A couple things I want to note. Family Emblem is pretty flexible. It's pretty much just good on any frontliner like Darius 3. If you get Draven 3 and you have an item slot, you can totally do that. Or just upgraded Pit Fighters, so that ends up being good. And speaking of Pit Fighter, one unit that I think ends up being really good is Powder 3, because by giving the Pit Fighter emblem to her, you end up healing a lot of HP when you drop below, right? You kind of like have a little healing effect. And that ends up being really nice for the Powder to cast multiple times very quickly and get some anti-heal onto your board. So that's why there's no like Sunfire or Red buff or anything like that, because Powder with the Pit Fighter can be pretty good with that. I do want to give a shout out to the family variation of Gloves Off, which plays around Vander, and the data suggests that you want to go for 6 Watcher, but you could also just play the standard family variation as well and totally have a lot of success. So I think Vander ends up being pretty good, but you do kind of struggle a little bit with itemization because you kind of want to give Violet and Vander the same items. But I think this augment has a lot of potential. One anomaly to look out for is Hunger for Power, because I saw someone have Vander consume Darius 3, and then he was literally unstoppable. So might be something to think about. Right behind Violet, and again kind of sort of at the bottom of S tier, top of A tier, is Black Rose, specifically around Silco and playing around Dominators. If you do get a Dominator emblem, you can actually play around 3 Black Rose and go for 6 Doms, and then tech in like Victor late game. The key to playing Black Rose at the moment is that 3 or 5 Black Rose seems to be much better than 4. 4 Black Rose got nerfed pretty hard. You only care about 4 Black Rose if the Black Rose units themselves are carrying, and that's kind of rare. You don't really have, Vlad and Elise and Cassio like holding items, let alone dealing damage. So it doesn't really matter very much, and it's a very low buff. So 3 or 5 or 7 is functionally how I approach Black Rose. The comp cap's really high, though. If you can get Mordekaiser 2 with items, he actually destroys, and Mordekaiser gains a ton of AP. And we realized that Mordekaiser doesn't really need AP if he has Dominator online. He mainly needs attack speed. So that way he casts, and then starts attacking and wailing, and he gets Omnivamp as well. Actually an insane amount of damage. So I would heavily prioritize having Mordekaiser 2 with attack speed items. And that's why things like Quicksilver, Edge of Night actually are good in tandem together. So you have a lot of safety net with it. And then Nashor's Tooth, which helps him cast, get the attack speed, and wail away. Sogo items are pretty much straightforward. Just Shojin, Nashor's, and Jewel Gauntlet, or maybe another Shojin. Maybe a red buff, just anything to help him get casting a lot and do a ton of damage. And he's really good with like mana anomalies, such as on kill or ally death or things like that. You do have options for Black Rose, for example. You can still play Elise carry. You can still play Malzahar and Heimerdinger, but the nose will be weaker. The one thing I want to shout out that people might not be thinking about is you can play Black Rose Experiment. And this is a little bit more versatile as well because Warwick is now in the set. So now you can have an additional splash. You can play Twitch inside the Scion package, and it actually kind of works because Mundo's a Dominator with the Cassio, and Morgana and Elise tie in the Nunu. So yeah, it all kind of works. I've seen 5 Black Rose, 5 Experiment with the Warwick, and it actually kind of popped off. So definitely keep an eye out for it. You can also just play this comp and then play Victor and call it a day. That's also totally cool. Emissary AD Flex has actually improved a lot, mainly because they buffed Mbessa in the base patch of 1424, and then they also buffed Corki. Plus, they have a lot more packages that you can play around it that are very good. So one package that people like to play, for example, is the Corki package behind Mbessa. And that's because Corki is probably the best 4-cost AD to reliably play around alongside Mbessa. But the problem with this composition is that's really, really expensive. Not only do you have to hit Corki, Mbessa, and Garen, who all 3 might be contesting your lobby, you have to upgrade them. And so it's very difficult to actually get to this composition because of how expensive it is. And also because if you have Mbessa 2, you have Nami 2, Tristana 2, but you have no Garens, it doesn't matter. You can't actually play all of them because you need the 4 Emissary to unlock it. That being said, you also have more things that you can play. You can, not play Rumble and Rel. Instead, you could play Vi and Twisted Fate. So you get Enforcer and the Quick Striker. You can also play Form Swappers. You can play Elise and Trundle, for example. Maybe Gangplank and Swain. You have a lot of different ways you can mix and match emissaries. So very flexible line. At its core, you pretty much just need Mbessa, Garen, Corki, Tristana, and then, Nami plus whatever else you can hit. Definitely one of the hardest lines to master, but very rewarding if you can figure it out, because I'm pretty sure this comp is quite good. But because it's so resource intensive, I would only recommend going for it on portals like Scuttle Puddle, or if you have like an insane econ opener, raining gold, slam in, some kind of insane like gold collector, portable forge start. AD Academy is also very good, and just really depends on whether or not you're able to stabilize around Jace. Jace is quite good, especially at 2-star. It capture board immensely high, and you can use Ezreal as a reliable early mid-game item holder until you get to Jace. Heimerdinger often ends up being played in this setup, but he's not a priority at all. A lot of times you end up just giving Heimer leftover AP items. So the bait with this composition is that a lot of people think you have to go out of your way to build blue buff, archangels. But I've seen people just, go Shojin guard breaker on Heimerdinger because that's just what the academy items had, and that's what they just had left over. So they went for it. And that Heimer still was really, high in damage and contributed well to the team. The core of the build is play around Academy plus 4 Sentinel. And you actually, as you may have noticed, can play different slots within Mel and Victor as well. If you have Lux, you can play Lux for 5 Academy and flex around that. You can play 6 Sentinel if you get +1. You can play Corki instead. You have Rumble, Ezreal, and Corki for the synergy of Artillers and Scrap. And you can also just kind of play around like Zoe and Rebels as well. Totally fine. This is actually a very flexible line. I actually really like Academy. It's one of my favorite lines to play at the moment because it's different every game. So your pathing is going to be slightly altered. The tricky thing about this composition is that Alawi is extremely contested, and if you don't actually hit Alawi because of all the Rebel players, all the Visionary Sentinel players, and just people in general holding Alawi, yeah, your front line kind of sucks. So a lot of times you're pretty much tanking like Rel 2, Leo 2, maybe a Loris 2, trying to make it work. So your front line ends up being pretty bad, which is why I end up putting the Anomaly priority on the front line. But you could also put on Heimerdinger or Jace if you end up hitting them. Enforcers are really good if you have the emblem. 8 Enforcer is fantastic. Everything about Enforcer, love it. It's just a ton of stats, a ton of HP. It's just really hard to deal with because it's just an overwhelming pile of stats on a bunch of big idiots. So, you know, it's very difficult to deal with the Vi 2 with 3000 HP, and she gets a bunch of damage amp. The challenge with this is you don't really have that strong of a board if you start off with Enforcer Crest and you don't have a upgraded Enforcer board. If you're playing like Maddie 1, Step 1, and you have like an Enforcer Crest, you're not doing anything. You're not killing anything. And then without that tempo, you don't have enough time to often stall for Caitlyn and the good 5 costs. Unless you hit any of these good augments, right? Like maybe you hit Martial Law. You could also play Betrayal, for example, with Maddie and Bessa. Like this is all possible of things that you can play, but it's a little bit awkward to hit Caitlyn. That said, if you get to this board, it is really good. And if you upgrade Caitlyn too, and you get to the 8 Enforcer board on level 9, it's very powerful. So I would recommend taking an Econ Augment and the Emblem and trying to get to 8s and get to that Caitlyn ASAP. Try to find really good Sentinels to tie it up with like Rumble. 6 Sentinel Tristana is another reroll con that's a little bit under the radar. But part of the reason why is because you kind of need specific items and you need to have a spot where you can rack up a bunch of kills with Tristana. The reason why it's good to have 6 Sentinel is because of 2 things. One, it allows you to go for something like Rage Blade Tristana to get ramping, so that way you can spam cast her bead and scale it. The second is that by playing fewer threats, you almost ensure that Tristana is going to be the one killing things. If you're playing 4 Artillerists and 4 Emissary, like the other variation of Tristana, I believe it's this, for example, like Corki might take some kills, Ezreal will take some kills, I mean, hell, Mbessa will take some kills. But if you play the Sentinel variation, it scales Tristana super fast. And by late game, I've seen something stupid like 90 to 100% AD, like basically doubling Tristana's AD. And then you give her things that synergize with her Anomaly, it can get pretty absurd. Not to mention that Sentinels are really cheap, so you can always play 4 Sentinels in the mid game and play around Tristana. The downside is that Tristana ends up being fairly contested because there might be 2 Emissary players, so it's pretty hard to hit Tristana. And as mentioned before, you might have trouble hitting like Alawi. You might even have trouble hitting things like Rel if there's a lot of Visionary players. So you probably don't really reliably get a bunch of 3-star Sentinels online, and you might have to be okay with just Tristana 3 plus your Sentinels. The best artifact by far for Tristana is Gold Collector because it just helps her execute, but I want to give a shout out to Fishbones, which is really fun because Fishbones actually can aim at a backline target with her ability and just one-shot them, and they're not ready for it. Fishbones can target anything on the board, basically. It doubles the range from 5 to 10 for Tristana, or either 4 to 8, and she should be able to hit everything. The last of these Sentinel boards that we're going to talk about is Sentinel Heimerdinger. This composition also was S tier, but they nerfed Heimer a lot. They nerfed Malzahar a lot, so they kind of killed some of its mid/top end. And instead now people play, you know, a backline of whatever they hit. So maybe it's Heimer plus Zoe. We have Heimer plus Corki here because it's like an easy connect with AD. You know, you take a bunch of tiers and rods, and sometimes you get infinite bows, swords, and gloves. You got to do something with it. You can put on Corki/Jace. It's a hybrid variation of basically the AD Academia line. I mean, they functionally feel very similar. We might even combine them later on. But I think that this is like because you're building Heimer items and you're thinking about Heimer. So just think of it as like AP Academy / Sentinels, because you do want to go for the 6 Sentinel ultimately. A question that's asked often is, do you play for Malzahar? And the answer is maybe if you are lacking Shred, or if you have the ability to get Malzahar 2 in the late game, it can be good. I will say that just like a single Victor is better because it helps stall for the Malzahar. I will say the single Victor is generally better because it ends up stalling better. And also, if you need more damage, just backline Jace, 2-star him, give him the 80 items, cut Corki, and just play something else, and just watch yourself succeed. Actually, this is so similar to the AD Academy. Actually, this is so similar to AD Academy. I think we just might combine it so we make the tier list a little bit more consolidated. Conquerors, man, I love this trait, but I'm pretty sure this trait cannot work without the emblem. I had so many times where I had good starts with it, and if you don't have the Conqueror emblem, you have to pivot into something else, like either Conqueror Emissaries, where you play 4 Conquerors and you go into like Mbessa plus all the Emissaries, or you have to just kind of use the Conqueror opener and transition to something else like Corki. Maybe you get a bunch of AP items, like you start off with Shojin Gangplank and you don't get the Conqueror +1. Maybe you go into Black Rose and try to aim for Mordekaiser plus Silco. That's also another thing you can pivot into. But the top end of Conquerors is really, really high, mainly because the cash outs just keep snowballing your lead. And think of it like you eventually get like prismatic pipeline worth of value the higher in the hundreds you go. And that lead tends to compound onto itself. So I love it a lot. I will say that Jace is a better item holder of the Conqueror emblem late. In fact, you can probably put Conqueror emblem on a bunch of 5 costs. You can put it on Rumble. You can put it on Jace. You can put it on... I've seen it on Warwick too, and that crush, but that's because it's Warwick 2. So don't be feeling like you have to play a specific way and always go for GP or GP3. And this is one of the lines where things like Artifactory ends up being phenomenal because just by the diverse set of damage types and units you have, you can use pretty much everything. If you get a bunch of AD, put it on like Gangplank and Jace. If you get a bunch of melee, try things on Mbessa, like Death Defiance, for example, Spectral Cutlass. If you get range extension like RFC and Sniper's Focus, you can put that on Mordekaiser. And if you get tank stuff, you can put it on anybody. So I love this comp for Artifactory. It's one of the best ones alongside Nocturne Reroll. Give it a try if you have an opportunity for it. And very quickly, let's go ahead through some of the other lesser popular comps, but they can pop off if you understand their conditions. So we're going to speedrun this a little bit. Experiment Twitch is mainly a +1 check, meaning that you need the Experiment emblem. And that's because it mainly lets you fit in 5 Experiment while dropping Zyra and having actual good frontline. You do need to hit Mundo and Twitch too, but I've seen a lot of people do a lot of powerful things with Experiment emblem. Most notably, you can actually play Victor with it, and it copies him, and it actually makes his interval timing chain his stun, which is really powerful. And you also can have an upside of hitting 7 Experiment with Warwick and just letting Warwick do Warwick things. Warwick's not bad. I think he has a reputation for being the weakest 6 cost, and that's not necessarily unfounded. But Warwick is surprisingly pretty decent for his utility. He helps actually shore up Twitch's weaknesses by executing a bunch of the units that Twitch didn't clean up. And then also, I think Warwick 2 is the best 6 cost 2-star in the game. He's better than Victor 2. He's better than Mel 2 by pretty decent margins. So I would probably prioritize. If I have a duplicator and I have a Warwick, I would probably save that. See if I can get Warwick 2, because that is game winning. Scrap is probably my least favorite AD line. It's so sad because I really like the play pattern of Scrap because you get like all these extra components. You get to think about like, oh, you know, what does this belt turn to versus sword? Really cool, complex stuff. But the reality is your units are very contested. Corki is hard to hit in this current meta. You need a Scrap emblem, and you also need to be high rolling because if you look, the composition's fairly expensive since you want to have like, you know, the good Sentinels. You need to hit Rumble, and you also kind of want to have a lot of items. It can be really tricky. I think this composition actually does cap pretty high though, because Rumble 2 with upgrades in the late game is actually really hard to deal with. And you can cap your board through a wide variety of things. Like you don't have to have, you know, Alawi and Elise. You could actually get like a Sentinel +1, then play for like Jace and do a bunch of other crazy things too. So I really do believe in the top end of Scrap. I just think that it has a lot of troubles both early game. Like I don't think Scrap is good on stage 2 and stage 3 without upgrades and a lot of tempo. And I think it really struggles on stage 4 unless you 2-star the Corki because you have no damage. Scrap is a defensive trait and gives you items, but it has no damage. And so if you're stuck on Corki 1 and Gangplank 2, you ain't killing anything. So yeah, I think Scrap is B tier for that reason. One thing I think is underrated is Form Swapper reroll, specifically around Gangplank and Swain 3, and there's a few variations you can play. The first is just to play 4 Form Swappers and then just like basically add in things that make sense trait-wise. Gangplank is a Scrap Form Swapper pit fighter, so let's play Rumble for Scrap. And that allows us to play Rel, which is a Conqueror and Sentinel that ties into Swain. And oh, that's a Visionary that ties into Nunu, which is a Bruiser that ties into Elise, right? So you just basically splash in a bunch of random traits. You can flex in a lot of different things, but all you really want to do is 4 Form Swapper. I've played 4 Form Swapper and 4 Emissary and rerolls Gangplank and Swain and has success as well. So you have a few different options, which is very, very fun. All you really need is 4 Form Swapper for the most part. Gangplank's really good with Rage Blades. This is actually one line you can think about if you slam Rage Blade and you're like, I can't really get the Twitch. You actually notice that Gangplank and Twitch have the same items. You can go for that. And also, you don't have to tank Swain. It's just easiest because Form Swapper gives him a lot of damage reduction, which is really nice. But you can also put Swain in the back line and have him carry with AP. If your front line, for some reason, is extremely good. Let's say you have like the ZZ Rod augment, or you have like a dummy that just gives you a ton of tankiness, and you're lacking damage, you can go for Swain backline with AP items. The other variation to chat out is why not both, which is 4 Form Swapper reroll, and you play frontline and backline. It is quite good. You probably need to update this just to make sure to give you the right Swain items, because I actually think you might want to backline Swain 3 with instead of tank Swain 3, and then have Swain 2 in the front. But I need to do a little bit more research and testing myself. Ziggs reroll is a thing, and I think Ziggs reroll and Camille, these are 2 rerolls that actually have a lot of things in common, which is it's a tempo reroll comp, meaning that you want to actually push levels and hit the 3-star as you're leveling. So yes, there's like a Blitzcrank 3, and yes, there's like a Smeech 3, but in the ideal scenarios, you're actually getting these units off of things like Caretaker's Ally or Worth the Wait, or you're just like going to 8 while carrying Ziggs 2 and just like hitting Ziggs rolling on 8. And that's sort of the same thing with Camille, because the power of the composition here is largely through the top end of its vertical. Like 5 Ambusher for Camille is extremely important. 15% durability is no joke. If you remember Warriors from the past set, that was similar to what they got for playing 6 Warriors. Ambushers is like that. So it gives you a lot of defensiveness. And then 6 Dominator is a lot of AP for Ziggs to let them start one-shotting stuff. But in order to do that, you kind of need to hit the Mordekaiser, and you want to hit like the Silco. So rolling on 6 means you're just going to be really far behind that. And same thing with the Camille as well. That being said, at least Camille does have... That being said, both these have really good artifact combos. Like Camille is extremely good with Prowler's Claw, Silvermere, or Spectral Cutlass. Those are the S+ tier artifacts that might allow you to not have to tempo. And then Ziggs is really good with Mana Zane in particular. That's like the one artifact I would probably consider being like, okay, maybe I stay on 6 and roll for Ziggs. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure I keep Ziggs and I push levels and try to hit Ziggs 3 on 8. Which is very similar to like Kindred. If you remember Kindred Faded from set 11, you would go for Syndra Faded and the frontline Thresh plus Set. You would go for Kindred 3 over time. Same thing with set 12. When you play Syndra, you would like go for Syndra 3 and Eldritch and Incanters and try to pick up Syndra 3 as you're like pushing levels to the game because you need the 7 Eldritch. This is similar to that. Nami reroll with Swain. This is basically just another like GP Swain variation type thing where you play Emissaries. It's like 3-cost reroll, but you play Nami Swain as the duo and you play Emissaries. This is probably the least consistent Emissary board, but the stats on it are great. And that's largely because if you can find a way to get Nami 3 and Swain 3 with 4 Emissaries, it's really good. But conceptually, this composition is insanely expensive. It's actually more expensive than the standard Emissary board because you need to hit Swain and Nami 3, and they are pretty contested in some of the setups, especially if they're playing around Conquerors or Sorcerers or just playing Swain and Black Rose. It can be really hard to hit these units. So it's like the most expensive for like a medium payoff, but it does do a lot of work if you can get it going. So usually the sign for this is you have a ton of reroll. Let's say you're playing Prismatic Ticket. Maybe you have Trifecta. Maybe you have something that like allows you to itemize a bunch of stuff and you're playing on Scuttlepot or something. Last but not least, this augment does okay in the data, so I feel like it's worth putting it here in B tier. It's built different. They buffed it, so now it gives you more flat stats. Built different's really hard to play though, to say the least, because I feel like build different this set is very similar to the last set where it's dependent on the 5 cost more than the 4 cost. If you look at it, build different actually caps the highest around like Mordekaiser, Jace, the 6 cost, and Rumble. And yes, the 6 cost and Rumble have, you know, traits that activate and don't necessarily get build different value, but they are so much better at supporting the rest of your comp that it's pretty insane. That being said, a lot of times you play around things like Twitch and Corki because they synergize really well with the stats that you get. And the best 5 costs in general to play around is Mordekaiser. And you can always play multiple copies. I prefer playing multiple Elises so you can get stuns, but the issue is that Elise 1 might not get a stun. So sometimes you play like Elise 2, throw in a random another Elise 1 to fill out your board. And there's also another trick that you could do, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend, which is to play 2 or 3 Emissary because they deactivate each other at 2 and 3 because you need to have 1 or 4. So you could play Garen 2 and Embessa 2. The problem with that is that those units are balanced around their Emissary trait, and so they actually are pretty weak without that buff. So yes, you can feel clever for doing that, but it's not actually that good. It's very similar to Zaya and Rakan from, I believe, Inkborn Fables at 11, where you could play both Zaya and Rakan. They were like a frontline backline thing. And if you played Zaya in the back and Rakan in the front, you would deactivate the trait. They're like, whoa, that was so great. And then you realize that part of what makes them a good unit is their abilities activating. So it's very, very similar to that. A couple more things I want to call out here in the situational tier. One, Menaces is a very, very high performing trait augment where you get Powder to turn into a Dominator. There's no like version of that, so we just put the Dominator on Powder. But 6 Doms with Powder Silco is absurd and allows you to build into that Dominator vertical. It's basically a Dominator emblem that comes with a Silco and a Shojin, which is pretty ridiculous. Menaces is basically like Dominator Crest, except instead of getting I believe a Blitzcrank or a Cassio, you get a Silco. And you also get a buffed up version of it because every time Powder to cast, it triggers Silco's monstrosities, which is based, I believe, off of Silco's AP, which is just insane. So very overtuned augments, and I think they're going to have to nerf this probably. Irradiate Blade Dance got buffed since the patch, and I think this is actually a good augment, but you need to go for 7 Rebels, and the challenge right now is that everybody's playing Irelia as the early game because so many people want Sentinel frontline. Renata wants frontline Sentinels, AD Academy wants it, Sentinel Tristana, Heimerdinger wants it, Rebels want it. So the really big downside of this augment is that Irelia is possibly one of the most played 1 costs in the game. But if you can hit it, I believe the upsides are tremendous and it's absolutely worth doing. So there you have it, my best comps that you should be focusing on for this patch. Some things might be moving up or down depending on how the meta develops, but I'm pretty sure that's a good snapshot of what to expect. And this is going to be our final patch of the year. And I believe the next time they're patching is going to be early mid-January. So it's going to be about 3 weeks of this patch. I'll be posting some guides about individual comps. If you guys have a specific request, let me know in the comments below or my community posts. And I guess that's it. So good luck on the climb. Have a good rest of the year. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. And I'll see you next time for more TFT action.